Good afternoon and welcome to today's meeting of the Commonwealth Club. The club is online at commonwealthclub.org as well as on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. I'm Robert Rosenthal, board member and until recently executive director at the Center for Investigative Reporting and your moderator for today's program. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Daniel Ziblatt, professor of government at Harvard University and co-author of the new book, How Democracies Die. Dr. Ziblatt has spent a career studying why democracies develop and how they die. Along with his co-author, Steve Levitsky, he's done this from his role at Harvard, where he also directs a research program called Politics Through Time. His focus as an academic and professor has always been about different places and periods in history, including the age of Hitler and Mussolini, and how governments moved to control not only their people, but their politics. Dr. Ziblatt has also previously served as director of Harvard Center for European Studies and at Stanford Center for Advanced Study. In this new book, he offers a revelatory look at the demise of liberal democracies around the world and a deep and disturbing look at decades-long trends in the United States that he believes mirror what has occurred around the world. His book really offers context and understanding of how America's political and cultural divide today is not surprising when you consider our history. So, I found the book really interesting, but I'm not sure I liked it in a lot of ways, and disturbing. So I'm just curious when you decided to write this book and what the process went, the time period in the context of what was happening in 2016, 15 in the American election, the presidential election. How did this happen? How did your book happen?
So I finished a book in 2017 that was a much more scholarly book with an academic press, and I kind of thought, I told my wife and kids that that was going to be it for a while. Over the course of the 2016 campaign, though, this was clear, actually, that this was not going to be the case, because my co-author and I, Steve Levitsky, we both teach together, and we've taught courses together at Harvard on democracy and democratization around the world, and we would run into each other, and we really came to a very quick kind of mutual understanding that what we were seeing in the tenor of the politics of the campaign, the primary, 2015, 2016, reminded us a lot of the periods and parts of the world we study, which were not the United States. So I study, as you mentioned, Europe, the 1930s, 1920s. Steve studies mostly Latin America, other developing countries. And so it was really the tenor of the campaign, the tenor of the politics, and a lot of the things that were being said reminded us very much, and there were these strong echoes of things we had seen elsewhere.
And so when did you actually begin writing the book? After the election or the build-up to it as you watched the election?
We wrote an op-ed in the New York Times right before the election. We wrote an op-ed right before the election, and then we wrote one right after the election in 2016. And then basically January 2017, we decided we would get to work on the book. And so we spent the year working on it 7 days a week, basically, and finished it.
And as an academic, and politics sometimes stay out, I guess, of the academic world, or there can be controversial. I mean, clearly, in reading this book, you had to believe that what was happening is that the Trump campaign and then his ascendancy to the presidency represented the potential of an authoritarian, or you saw him as an authoritarian. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's right, and that's really what motivated the book. And so, we're social scientists, and we take the kind of professional ethos of being social scientists very seriously. So this is not a partisan book. What motivated us in part was there was a great book that we cite that we developed this idea from, that Juan Linz, who was a Spanish political scientist who wrote in the 1970s, who was born in Weimar, Germany, who grew up during the Spanish Civil War and had laid out a set of criteria by which one could judge political leaders whether or not they are authoritarian. So this was something as a kind of index, or sort of what he calls a litmus test of behaviors and rhetoric that he developed in the 1970s. And we taught this to our students, in talking about interwar Europe or Latin America in the 60s and 70s. And what was so striking was that the criteria that he laid out fit to a T the rhetoric of candidate Trump. And so, I could lay out what some of these characteristics are. So first of all, challenging basic rules of the democratic game, so challenging the legitimacy of elections, accusing your rival of being a kind of subversive or a criminal, going after media and the civil liberties of a democracy, and condoning violence. So these were things that, again, were very common in the 1920s and 1930s in Europe, and also 1960s and 70s in Latin America. And it was just this kind of uncanny resemblance to the rhetoric that candidate Trump was using.
Yeah, and I've read the book, so I was going to ask you about that, and you jumped the gun on me, which you're not supposed to do. But and I love being able to tell a professor that. But I'm going to read a little bit, because I think for the audience, and I hope you read this book, it gives you a deeper understanding, and what you said, rejection of weak commitment to democratic rules of the game, and then you detail it. And that's point one. Do they reject the Constitution or express a willingness to violate it? Do they suggest a need for anti-democratic measures such as canceling elections, violating or suspending the Constitution, banning certain organizations, or restricting basic civil or political rights? Do they seek to use or endorse extra constitutional means to change the government, such as coups, violent insurrection, or mass protests? So really, in reading this, I could see how you came to that conclusion, and one of the most striking ones in here and throughout the campaign and the rhetoric we have today, do they describe their rivals as subversive as opposed to the existing constitutional order? Do they claim that their rivals constitute an existential threat to national security or to the prevailing way of life? And in reading this, one of the things that's also striking, we're seeing it today, is what I would call the demonization of the other. And in American history, the book really lays out the Alien and Sedition Acts in the period with Jefferson and Adams, and how the language and how they really saw each other as enemies and traitors. Right. So in American history, I mean, this analogy or this feeling is not new. And how can you describe how you tie it into the present moment and how important our history is to understand?
Yeah, so the idea that there's going to be competing groups, competing politicians who compete for office, who have equal right to govern, and may have the idea that nobody has a monopoly on truth, and that the competition of ideas is actually the best way to come up with good public policy to make our system work. That is an invention. I mean, that idea that we accept our rivals as merely rivals and not as enemy is somewhat counterintuitive. I mean, we take it for granted today, but it's somewhat counterintuitive. I mean, if you think you know what the truth is, why would you ever tolerate somebody else coming along and challenging you? And so, in the U.S., beginning in the 1790s, our founding fathers, as brilliant as they were, did not have this conception in their minds. And so, we sometimes forget that the very word political party doesn't exist in the Constitution. The concept barely existed. And so the idea that there would be competing parties with competing visions of the best way to organize society really was an invention that came about right at in the 1790s, beginning of the 19th century. And so as that notion developed, and as people began to regard each other as legitimate, and that was a kind of really an important transformation in American politics that took place over the first quarter of the century, people began to regard each other as simply rivals and not as enemies. Nonetheless, throughout our history, that's come back. I mean, with the Civil War, that's essentially what the Civil War was a fight over a kind of the idea that one side is maybe doesn't have a legitimate worldview, and so a war breaks out when these conflicts aren't resolved peacefully.
So as you watch what's happened since the election, I mean, what's your feeling? Are we going towards a precipice? I know what you say in the book, but I mean, who describe the role of the gatekeeper and how in a democracy, not only the gatekeepers stepping aside, and maybe a little bit how the gatekeepers can actually do their role.
Yeah, well, so one of the points that we make in the book is that there really is no pure golden age that we can go back to. That there's always been throughout American history politicians, political leaders, demagogues who have a weak commitment to democratic norms. And so in the book we talk about Henry Ford as somebody, the founder of Ford Motor Company, who was cited by Adolf Hitler, Mein Kampf, as a great hero of his, who wanted to run for president, considered running for president. Huey Long, who was the authoritarian governor of Louisiana and senator from Louisiana. Joe McCarthy is somebody who didn't really subscribe to this notion of mutual toleration entirely. George Wallace. And so, going just through the 20th century alone, there are all of these kinds of figures who depart from what we conceive of as democratic norms. None of these guys made it to the White House or ever close to the White House. And so part of the point of our book is to say that there's this long continuous strand, at least through the 20th century. And there's Gallup poll data also showing that each of these guys gained around 30% approval ratings in Gallup polls going back to the 1930s. So there's always been this latent strand, a continuous strand alongside our liberal traditions of an illiberal tradition. So the question is, how have these guys been kept out? And this is where gatekeeping comes into the story, because what we argue in the book is that the reason these guys never became president or ever gained the nomination of parties is that our parties have played this absolutely critical role of not only representing people and competing for power, but in the selection of presidential candidates. And up until the beginning of the 1970s, we had a system that was very much dominated by party leaders, where you didn't have primaries, and so these party leaders got together in what we now critically call the smoke-filled back room, where these leaders got together. They would, at convention time, choose who they thought would be the best candidate, and they kept these guys out. And so, although this system perhaps wasn't very democratic, it had the positive side of keeping these demagogues out. This system has now fallen off, I think, since the beginning of the 1970s. With the opening up of the primary system, this was certainly a more transparent system, a more open system. But the downside of this, and there were some political scientists, a Berkeley political scientist, Nelson Polsby, who wrote in the 1970s saying, with the introduction of the primary system, the filtration system has broken away, and there's now the possibility of demagogues arising. So I think actually our system has been much more vulnerable since the beginning of the 70s to a figure like Donald Trump.
And who are the key gatekeepers in Washington today?
There's not many. I mean, in some ways, that's part of the problem, I would argue. So, the Republican Party is in many ways not much of a party. We kept waiting during the primaries for the Republican establishment to step in. This was a phrase that was frequently used. But it became very clear that if there is a Republican establishment, they don't have much sway. Somebody like Mitt Romney could come along and condemn Trump, but this really swayed no voters. And so, in many ways, I think the party, the idea of a hierarchical party, which again some people might think is not a very democratic way to organize a party, it turns out that's actually a very effective way of keeping these kind of threats out of the political process. The gatekeepers have broken apart, I think, to a large degree. The Democratic Party has a system of superdelegates in place, which is now actually under some criticism. Which in a way, which was introduced in the 1980s to kind of supplement the primary system. So local political leaders, congressmen, congresswomen, important leaders within the party help have a say in who the candidates are. And so these are important gatekeepers, but there's a lot of pressure now to remove even superdelegates within the Democratic Party.
And I guess one thing, that I took away is that the gatekeepers, in a sense today, would be the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan.
Right.
Mitch McConnell in the Senate, and they basically, from your point of view, have done what?
Yeah, abdicated. That's we have a chapter called the Republican abdication. What's really important to emphasize here is that during the presidential selection process for the Republican Party, it was clear the Republican establishment did not like Donald Trump. He was not the favorite. He was not the inside candidate. They thought he was unfit for office. And nonetheless, he won the nomination, and I think it's in part because these guys didn't draw the line, and so they essentially allowed this to take place, and there was lots of maneuvering, and and political leaders were guys like Mitch McConnell, guys like Paul Ryan thought that maybe there would be some maneuvering where we could keep Trump out, but in the end they failed in their job, and one of the jobs of political parties is to serve as gatekeepers, and they failed in that job.
So I'm not sure how many people who support Donald Trump have spoken to you, but what kind of feedback, or do you get any? Yeah. Because clearly you're calling the president an authoritarian and a great danger to America.
Right. Yeah, so we've talked to lots of different people. One kind of feedback we've gotten is, this is you're encouraging everybody to be mutually tolerant of your opposition, but now you're calling your opposition an authoritarian. That's not very mutually tolerant of you. And the reason I think that's not quite a fair point is that, there is actually, in fact, some people say, well, we accused Obama of being an authoritarian, and you guys thought that was outrageous, and now you're accusing our leader of being an authoritarian. That's equally outrageous. And I think the point is that there are clear indicators, using these objective criteria from Juan Linz of going after the media, accusing the media of being the enemy of the people, saying without any empirical base that your rival is a criminal, needs to be locked up. These are clear. We live in a fact-based world. These are clear violations of democratic norms that people can agree upon. And some people may say, well, we don't take the kind of rhetoric seriously, and that's maybe a reasonable response. My co-author and I take the rhetoric seriously because what we've seen is around the world, usually when politicians speak in this way, they then act in that way. And so we take the rhetoric seriously. So the only defense I would say is, well, we don't take the rhetoric seriously, but the rhetoric is a genuine threat to democracy, and I think most people actually agree with that.
Well, one of the things the book does is look at what sort of almost a gradual slide from democracy into authoritarian regimes historically around the world, and especially in Central and South America.
Yeah.
And if you have to read the book to get into all the detail, but the other thing, you use the phrase backsliding from democracy into authoritarian regimes or dictatorships or military governments. And one of the things you say is that if citizens are open to authoritarian appeals, then sooner or later democracies will be in trouble. And you also say this backsliding begins at the ballot box. So how does that apply to the United States?
Well, one of the title of the book is How Democracies Die, and one of the big points that we make in general is that the way democracies have die has changed over time. During the Cold War, 3/4 of democratic breakdowns, according to some estimates of political scientists, happened by military coup. So we think of Pinochet in Chile in 1973 with jet planes flying overhead and bombing the presidential palace, or tanks in the streets. That's the traditional way we think of democracies dying, and that is the way that democracies died during the Cold War. Since the collapse of communism, most democracies now die, as we say, at the ballot box, through elections, where you have presidents or prime ministers getting elected through democratic elections. So they have some, democratic credentials, certainly, but once in office, through legislation, through judicial rulings, through referenda, they attack the very institutions of democracy that brought them into power. And so we talk about Erdogan in Turkey is doing this, Viktor Orban, who recently was reelected in Hungary, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. Now, the U.S. is certainly very different because we still have a vibrant democracy. I mean, we don't think that American democracy is dead or dying by any means, but there are certain similarities where you have somebody coming to power who, like these other figures, shows a weak commitment or indifference to democratic norms, and then once in office, what do they do? And lots of people thought, our institutions would contain Donald Trump, and to a large degree, they have, but there are signs that this kind of playbook that these other leaders have used is something that the current president of the United States has attempted to do, with not much success so far, but has attempted to do.
What's an example of that?
So one of the things that we say that we've noticed that elected authoritarians do, one of the first things they do is because they get elected, they're usually outsiders, they come into power, and people and media and establishment society is very nervous about this, and so they push back and they accuse them of being an authoritarian to some degree. And so one of the things that these guys do is they go after the referees of the political system or judicial institutions, rule of law institutions, tax authorities, regulatory authorities, and turn these bodies that are supposed to be neutral into defenders of their own interests and use them as weapons to go after their rivals. So, to give you an example of this, not happening in the U.S., but elsewhere, President Erdogan, he's still prime minister, in December 2013, when there was a corruption investigation being undertaken and that was getting closer and closer to his family, he simply fired all the prosecutors very quickly. Viktor Orban, after becoming prime minister, one of the first things he did with a supermajority, so allowing him to revise the Constitution because he had a 2/3 majority, he changed the retirement age and lowered the retirement age of Supreme Court justices, and so that all of these justices had to retire so he could stack up the courts. So in the United States, we haven't seen things reach that level. But what we certainly have seen, everybody here will recognize, the firing of the FBI director, pressure applied to the Justice Department. And so all of these kinds of efforts to capture the referees of the political system resonate. There's certainly been a lot more pushback in the United States. I wouldn't want to kind of say that we're in an identical situation as these other countries. There's a lot more attention to it. And in these other countries, this stuff has happened often in the dead of night, and people don't really even realize it's happening. Here, this has obviously gotten lots of media attention and investigative journalists kind of revealing a lot of this stuff. So, but there are these similarities for sure.
So I'm going to read in your book where you address that, because to me it's really important to understand. And this is what you wrote. It always helps to have the referees on your side. Modern states possess various agencies with the authority to investigate and punish wrongdoing by both public officials and private citizens. These include the judicial system, law enforcement bodies, the intelligence, tax, and regulatory agencies. In democracies, such institutions are designed to serve as neutral arbiters. For would-be authoritarians, therefore, judicial and law enforcement agencies pose both a challenge and an opportunity. If they remain independent, they might expose and punish government abuse. It's a referee's job, after all, to prevent cheating. But if these agencies are controlled by loyalists, they could serve a would-be dictator's aims, shielding the government from investigation and criminal prosecutions that could lead to its removal from power. The president may break the law, threaten citizens' rights, and even violate the Constitution without having to worry that such abuse will be investigated or censured. With the courts packed and law enforcement authorities brought to heel, governments can act with impunity. Capturing the referees provides the government with more than a shield. It also offers a powerful weapon, allowing the government to selectively enforce the law, punishing opponents while protecting allies. So, do you know if anybody in Congress read your book or got feedback?
Yeah,
Did you get feedback?
It's been, yes, I mean, mostly from Democratic members of Congress. I think we actually, that our publisher did send copies of it to Jeff Flake. Who knows what, I'm not sure what kind of difference that makes. But, one of the key things also that we, part of the purpose of writing the book was that we see there's lots of noise. I mean, there's, every day, just as we're sitting here, probably people's Twitter feeds are filled up with like more outrageous things. And so, how do we distinguish between kind of significant threats and things that are just annoying and, not really worth worrying about? And part of the point of the book is to point out these patterns that we see around the world to give citizens and readers a kind of framework for understanding the nature of the threats that our society faces. So, when you see, and to put it in context, so when you see, the president going after the media or going after law enforcement institutions, then we can sort of say, well, this is significant because this is how this pattern has unfolded in other countries.
And, historically, I mean, again, what I found very powerful and great reminder is a lot of history in this book, which shows, again, that while we're in the moment in the United States, these strands, these authoritarian issues have happened before.
Right.
And they're part of who we are, and this divide. But also, you reference, when Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, the actions of presidents which were seen as dictatorial, when Franklin Roosevelt tried to pack the Supreme Court, or interred the Japanese during the start of World War II. I mean, do these offer precedents that an authoritarian president today or in the past have tried to use and say, look what they did?
Yeah, as well as Watergate, I would add to that list of abuses of presidential power. Yeah, I guess one of the things that we point so to take the example, I mean, the Civil War is distinctive in that this was in the midst of war, the suspension of habeas corpus, and so. But in many ways, an analog to the kind of things that we're seeing today are with Roosevelt's attempt to pack the Supreme Court, as well as Nixon's abuses. And in both cases, though, at the end of the day, these efforts of ambitious presidents were limited. And so what happened during the New Deal was President Roosevelt was frustrated by the Supreme Court that was, every one of the members of the Supreme Court in the 1930s had received their law education. This is a fact I discovered in writing this in the 19th century. So the Supreme Court was loaded up with all these old guys who were blocking Roosevelt's agenda, and had I been alive at the time, I might have been, thought, well, the idea of, and so they were blocking all the legislation, so he thought, well, why don't we expand the size of the court, because there's nothing in the Constitution specifying the size of the court, and so he can load up the court with his allies who would support the New Deal. And had I been alive at that time, this is an interesting kind of thing. Maybe this would have been a good thing for the New Deal. I may have supported it. But with the distance of time, I can also see that this would have set a dangerous precedent because it would have turned the Supreme Court into a kind of body whose size could be changed and used as a even more explicit political tool than many people might regard it today. And this is something that happens, as I mentioned, in Hungary as well as Venezuela and other countries. And so what the important part of that story, though, about Roosevelt is that he proposed this kind of effort to expand the court, and then he was going to load it up with his supporters. Democratic members of Congress and the Senate pushed back against this. It was of course, Republicans pushed back against it, but more significant was that Democrats pushed back. And it wasn't just Southern Democrats. There were some real New Deal Democrats. There's one senator we describe in the book who's from Wyoming who was so close to Roosevelt, he was at the inauguration dinner with him, sitting next to Eleanor Roosevelt, and then within several weeks after he announced this idea to expand the court, he came out publicly saying he was against this. And so it was when party allies come out against the potential abuses of a president, that's when these things can be halted. And so the question that we ask is today, we don't see that same kind of thing happening on the Republican side. And so when you see clear things that are clear violations of democratic norms and rules, it's critical that the president's partisan allies come out against it. And if that doesn't happen, then there's really no constraint.
So there are examples of where the gatekeepers eventually took action.
Right, that's right.
I guess Watergate.
And
is the
Watergate
same.
as well, and a similar kind of story where some Republican senators came to Nixon and said, "We're going to impeach you unless you resign." People have pointed out correctly that it took a long time to get to that point, but nonetheless, at the end of the day, Nixon had to resign, and so the gatekeepers, as you say, stopped them.
Do you have any concerns in writing a book like this that you become an enemy? Or have you been called an enemy?
Yeah,
or a
well,
traitor,
we get lots of weird email and phone messages on my work voicemail. So yeah, but it's at some level, I've spent my life studying distant historical phenomena that are not in the headlines. And then suddenly my area of expertise suddenly seemed relevant. And so I felt a certain obligation to kind of embrace that particular moment. I mean, it reminds me a bit of this. There's this incredible story of this biologist who studied butterflies his whole career and migration patterns of butterflies. And there was these intense kind of theoretical debates among biologists about where the butterflies were flying between North and South England. He spent his whole career doing this. He was an obscure figure. And then the UN climate change report came along, and this was a key piece of evidence because where they were migrating had changed. And so this was included in the UN climate change report. So I think, from my view of all of this is, I've spent my career studying these things, and so at the moment, my area of expertise is relevant, and so I have a kind of obligation to
So
engage
in
public
the
debate.
current moment we're in, have you been surprised, or is it more like evidence for you of the move towards authoritarianism? And do you see anything rising up to steer it in another way?
Yeah, well, I guess two thoughts. One, before the election of Donald Trump, my book that I wrote in 2017 on conservative parties throughout history in the 19th century in Britain and Germany, I'd always known that when you have conservative parties that become unhinged, so whether that's in Weimar Germany or contemporary Republican Party, that this is bad news for democracy. So I was already very nervous about what the state of American democracy. But again, like to take another global climate change example, I sort of had this view that our American democracy is in trouble. But in the middle of 2016, had you asked me, I would have said American democracy is in trouble maybe 20 years from now. This is a problem that my children are going to have to deal with. I didn't expect that this problem would come overnight, and that's so the problem came much. It would be as if we're sitting around here thinking about the tides are rising with climate change. If you were to wake up one morning, look out your door, and the tide was at your door. I mean, these things happen much more quickly.
So what accelerated it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think. I don't know why things. Maybe I feel like I kind of understood the dynamics, the sources of this problem. Again, the radicalization, I think, of the Republican Party is one of the prime movers. And in the book, we make the case that the radicalization of the Republican Party is a long-term process, and things can happen quickly. I mean,
Well, you traced it back to Newt Gingrich, really.
Right. That's right.
And how did that happen?
Yeah. So beginning in the 1990s, we say that historians can debate this, whether this is correct, but we can provide evidence that the polarization in American politics, which is what really is the deeper underlying problem, not Donald Trump, but this kind of deeper problem of polarization, began on the Republican side in the beginning of the 1990s, even in the late 80s, when Republicans had been out of the House of Representatives for 40 years, and to get back into the House, led by Newt Gingrich, they carried out this incredible kind of campaign with changed rhetoric to attack our basic institutions. And so, they had...
Can you recall some of the rhetoric?
Yeah,
It's
so
striking.
Newt Gingrich distributed tapes to potential candidates in which he taught people which language to use, so accused Democrats of not loving the country, hating the flag, and this will kind of, if you think back to the early 90s, this is the kind of rhetoric that was suddenly in the air, and the Democrats were not really, it began to get into this language of Democrats are not really loyal Americans, don't love the country, and they're weak. I mean, there were a set of adjectives that Gingrich came up with, weak, and so on, that were intended to kind of provoke voters, to make voters not like Democrats. So this was an effort to regain the House, but it was rooted, and I think what Gingrich didn't invent this entirely from scratch. It was rooted in what he perceived. He was the first to recognize an opportunity. There was this growing polarization in American society that we argue goes back actually to the 60s. He saw an opportunity here and grabbed the opportunity and transformed the Republican Party in the process.
So here's a question from the audience. How does the social and economic context in America, I think ahead of the election of Trump, compare with the real and economic context in other countries that also elected authoritarian leaders.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's what's certainly true is that these outsiders who often don't have much political experience, think of Hugo Chavez, Alberto Fujimori in Peru, often have successful careers in reaction to and take advantage of economic crises. And so, I mean, one of the reasons Hugo Chavez eventually became president of Venezuela is a long period of economic crisis. And so, in some sense, we might think that the financial crisis of 2008 played an important role. One of the most striking economic figures that I've seen recently, this is not in our book, but I think that has transformed our societies. If you look at growth and productivity rates from 1945 to 2016, I mean, it's basically an even 45-degree angle up. It's an increasing productivity of American workers. If you look at average wage growth in that same period, wage growth perfectly parallels it. And then suddenly in 1980, wage growth flatlines, productivity continues to increase. And so it's that disjuncture, which in effect, contributes to inequality, which means that people have a decreased confidence that their children will be better off than they are, which, that has never really happened before or in the last 100 years. And so these kinds of economic conditions create ripe conditions for demagogues to appeal to people's dissatisfactions. And certainly our elected leaders need to address these underlying concerns, but the question is to do it, the issue is to do it in a way that doesn't challenge our democratic institutions.
Another audience question. You note the importance of referees staying neutral. I worry that even if the referees stay neutral, there's a real belief that, quote, the system is rigged, close quote. How can we regain democratic norms when much of the country no longer trusts the norms?
Yeah. Well, in our book, we argue that there's two key norms, two kind of big norms in our political system that have made it work. One is this norm that we've already talked about of mutual toleration, and the other norm is a norm we call forbearance, which is essentially, this is an unwritten, the idea is that there are these unwritten rules that govern the behavior of our political leaders. And this norm of forbearance is essentially the self-conscious underutilization of power. And in order for our political system to work, we need to have political leaders who don't actually use all of the rights that they have or prerogatives that they have. So the president, just to give you an example, can pack the court at any point he wants, or the Congress can impeach a president for any reason it wants. It's perfectly legal. I mean, there's really nothing in the Constitution saying, it's high crimes and misdemeanors. It's up to Congress to decide this. In order for our system to remain stable, the norm of forbearance, where politicians don't play to the hilt, is necessary, and that is a norm that's actually eroding. When we see politicians, shutting down government when they don't get what they want, this is the opposite of forbearance. And so the question is, how do we restore these two norms of mutual toleration and forbearance? One of the dilemmas that we, I think, face today is that when facing a norm-breaking president, and if you don't like the norm-breaking president, there's a great temptation to respond in kind and to say, well, we need to fight dirty too. If we're going to be, if the Republican Party, for instance, when President Obama appointed a Supreme Court justice, a nominated Supreme Court justice, when the Republican Senate didn't even hold hearings for him, this was an unprecedented violation. I mean, in my mind, one of the worst violations of norms we've seen in a long time, where the Senate essentially didn't even hold hearings, which was this is the first time they've done this since the 1860s, to not even hold hearings. And so now the question is, if Democrats retake the Senate, President Trump gets the opportunity to nominate a presidential or a Supreme Court justice, should Democrats respond in kind by not even holding hearings? And some people argue that this is what's necessary. There's a recent book that's come out, It's Time to Fight Dirty, I think it's what it's called, by David Ferris. And so in terms of restoring our norms, we make the case in our book that this, although tempting to kind of fight back in dirty ways, is not the right way to go. That this, in fact, leads to an escalation, leads to a tit for tat, where eventually a kind of death spiral is entered into. And this is what we've seen in the breakdown of democracies in other parts of the world. And so, so I think one of the key things that we have to do is citizens have an important role in trying to get their elected leaders to not behave in this way, not reward them for a kind of no holds barred sort of stance towards politics.
Do you see that happening? I mean, are you following what's happening as we get into the midterms?
Yeah. I think the Democratic Party leaders in the Senate and the House have actually been quite restrained. I mean, for instance, although there's lots of push for impeachment immediately without seeing the results of the investigation, if there are kind of things that come out through the special counsel that suggest that there needs to be, there's been high crimes and misdemeanors. Certainly there should be impeachment, but, this should be undertaken. However, until we have the final results of that, I think impeachment should not be something that's on the table. And I think actually, and there's lots of pressure to take a strong stand on this, but I think, I think actually Democratic leaders have been actually pretty restrained and they've behaved quite responsibly.
Well, in the book you cite when Obama was first elected, Paul Ryan's statements, Mitch McConnell's statements, which basically were our number one goal is
Right.
just for the Obama presidency to fail.
Right.
It wasn't about what's best for America.
Yeah. So again, this is the idea that it's hard. It's hard to make the case, and I'm sure there's people sitting here in the audience who are thinking, if this makes no sense, if one side's fighting dirty, we have to fight back. It's just, and it's under certain conditions, under certain extreme conditions, when there's no other opportunities available for winning elections, then that may be necessary. But as long as there's a chance for a Democratic opposition to play by the rules, we need to, fight hard. Democrats need to fight hard, but Democrats need to do so in a way that reinforce democratic norms.
Well, I guess part of, in reading the book, I was again fantasizing or wondering if you or your co-author had ever met with some of the Republican leadership, or I asked if jokingly if they read your book. Because what you're really talking about, or what you're saying is, well, they're just playing a game. They don't really think bad things will happen.
Yeah.
But your book also shows historically that when the political leaders sort of step aside, or this isn't serious, we'll play along for a little while, boom, the mousetrap.
Right. There's
rat trap.
I think all of us have been guilty of the idea that some way our elected leaders can act as recklessly as they want. And it doesn't matter. Our political institutions can endure, and we've sort of taken democracy for granted in the United States. And I think one thing that's become apparent, again, and that's part of the purpose of writing the book, is that that's not the case. I mean, elected leaders can't act as recklessly as they want. And so we have to demand of them that they act in ways that reinforce democratic norms.
So a couple of questions, I'm not going to read them exactly, but ask or concerned about younger people, high school kids, millennials, and their knowledge or lack of history or even service. I mean, have you had a chance to talk to any people like that? I'm not sure your students, maybe not in that group, or what's your feeling about
I just spoke at a high school
history?
yesterday out in Danville, and spoke to two different groups, a group of students and then some of the teachers. I think this is certainly critical. There is one of my colleagues and friends, Yasha Monk, has a book called The People Against Democracy, in which he cites some survey evidence showing that younger people tend to be less committed to democratic norms than older people. I'm not sure if I fully believe the results of that. I mean, I think that there's a lot of noise in the data, but there are people who have made the case that younger people in surprising ways are less committed to democratic norms. Again, I'm not sure if that's right, but it's certainly the case that one thing that has passed away to some degree is the kind of role of civics education. So another colleague of mine, Robert Putnam, is doing research on the kind of evolution of civics education in America from the beginning of the 20th century to today. And there's actually a bill in front of the Massachusetts State Assembly calling for a revamping of civics education in Massachusetts, which is really an exciting project. I've heard a bit about it. The League of Women Voters was involved in helping design this, and what they call it is an active civics engagement, active civics curriculum where students not only sit in class but actually participate in service. And I think these kinds of things are really critical.
Well, one of the things that's striking and a reminder to me in reading the book again was sort of the role of, and especially in the South, blocking people's voting rights. And it's obvious contemporary. Can you talk a little bit about the history of like the poll tax and what the Democrats did in the South after the Civil War and sort of the vestige of what we're seeing that activated today?
Yeah, we often forget that the United States was really not a democracy until 1965, in 64, 65, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. Because until this period, so after the Civil War, with Reconstruction, there was the imposition of voting rights for all Americans across the U.S. South, when the federal troops were there in part to enforce it. But with the end of Reconstruction and a deal struck between national political leaders, the Republicans withdrew from the South, and it was left up to the states to enforce voting rights. And the Democratic Party in the South gradually, first through legal changes, then first through violence, then through legal changes, then through constitutional changes, impose these restrictions, the poll tax, and all of these kinds of neutral-sounding taxes, reforms that were intended, often justified with the language of cleaning up elections, getting rid of election fraud, which were in effect literacy tests, all sorts of creative. There was one called the seven box test, where they would have It was in effect a literacy test where each ballot for each office, so it would be like a congressional and gubernatorial race all at the same time with the names of the races in each box, and you had to put a separate ballot in each box. And so if you were illiterate, you wouldn't know which box to put it in. If you put it in the wrong box, then the ballot would be tossed out. So these kind of very creative ways of restricting the right to vote. Which in turn gave rise to a single-party South and an authoritarian regime within the United States for 70, 80 years. And so, what's a couple of things that are important about that is, first of all, that this kind of thing does happen in the United States. Second of all, that often efforts to clean up to implement election restrictions and restrictions on voting rights are sort of justified with this neutral and sort of positive-sounding things of cleaning up elections. And again, we've seen this kind of thing happen in other countries. And so I think, it's important to see that this can happen in the U.S. as well.
So another audience question, which type of democracy is better at preventing the slide to non-democracy, presidential or parliamentary, majoritarian or consensus-oriented?
That sounds like a question asked by a political scientist, I think must be in the audience. A student of comparative politics. Well, I would have often thought that it would be a presidential system. I mean, a lot of the Latin American cases or all of the Latin American cases that my co-author really is expert in, these are all presidential systems where you get this kind of escalating tit for tat between the different branches of government. And when these norms of mutual toleration and forbearance disappear, you get escalation where each branch of government really, when the president's party is in control of the Congress acts as a lapdog and lets the president get away with whatever he or she wants. When the Congress is in the opposite party's hands, the Congress, rather than just being a guard dog, becomes, there's kind of institutional warfare that takes place. So the presidential system is extremely vulnerable to this kind of escalating politics. In general, presidential systems die at a higher rate than parliamentary systems. That's correct. But there are some exceptions to this. And Viktor Orban in Hungary, this is a parliamentary system. And once, he kind of reconfigured the electoral rules to turn 45% pluralities into supermajorities, and then he can rule without any constraint. So if in a parliamentary system, an elected leader gets control of the government with a supermajority, it's very dangerous. But in general, presidential systems seem to be more vulnerable to these problems.
And I'm going to skip around here, but there are a couple of questions about the DNC acting like gatekeepers with Bernie Sanders, which you can address. But also, when you look at history and authoritarians who are in power, what kind of opponent can beat an authoritarian? Mm-hmm. So there's two parts.
Once they're in power?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, what do you think, I mean, the DNC role as a gatekeeper?
Yeah, so the Bernie Sanders is not a threat to democracy by any means. I mean, he's an outsider. Outsiders are not necessarily threats to democracy. Outsiders are often very democratic. And Barack Obama was arguably an outsider to the Democratic Party when he ran for president in 2008. Bernie Sanders is an outsider. These are political leaders. There have been Republican outsiders who remain committed to democratic norms. So the kind of system of gatekeeping that I've described that dominated historically, the downside of that system is that it probably kept out some good democratic outsiders, and some mediocre insiders won. One of my favorite examples that we cite in the book is Warren G. Harding, who looked like a president. He had a square jaw, and that's sort of partly why these guys picked him, but he was a mediocre president. And the insiders in the smoke-filled back room picked this guy. So in many cases, these kind of gatekeeping systems keep out good potential candidates. But on the other hand, they also keep out lots of bad guys. And so I think, somebody like Bernie Sanders arguably was hurt by the fact that he was not part of the Democratic Party. Actually, was not a member of the Democratic Party, and the party insiders, the superdelegates, didn't favor him. But that wasn't the entire story with Bernie Sanders. But I think sometimes people read our book as being in some ways we have a hidden agenda of justifying keeping Bernie Sanders out. That's not at all the case. I mean, Bernie Sanders doesn't really at all fit within this framework. I mean, it's just an unintended potential negative effect of this that keeps out people like Bernie Sanders.
What's assets? I mean, back to you've really studied Trump and his skills and his ability to communicate. Is what kind of opponent is going to be able to stand up to that, or you think gather strength? when you look at those
Yeah,
authoritarian
it
values.
sounds like somebody's asking me to, say which presidential nominee should we choose
No,
to
no,
run
I
against
mean
them. Yeah.
the skills. I'm really, or
Yeah.
the attributes, or the,
Yeah.
even in terms of communications.
Well, I don't think we should look for solutions with single individual leaders. I think we have to think about the kinds of coalitions that beat these guys typically. And actually, there's something happening right now in Turkey that's fascinating that hasn't gotten a lot of media attention. So President Erdogan, who's a classic electoral authoritarian who's entrenched himself in power, he called early elections in June that are coming up. And the kind of assumption was there's parliamentary and presidential elections, he would sweep the table and win again. But what's happened is that the opposition has gotten its act together, and this very diverse opposition has begun to coalesce in very surprising ways. And there are lots of people who are beginning to think that actually the opposition has a chance. And so one of the things that has to happen is that that diverse groups that disagree on a lot of things have to come together. And what they often have in common are a commitment to democratic norms. And so when facing a real democratic emergency, it's absolutely critical for political rivals to put aside those differences to defeat somebody who's a threat to democracy. To give you another example of this, in 2017, the French presidential election, there's a two-round election system. The mainstream parties didn't make it to the second round. In the second round, you had Marine Le Pen, an anti-immigrant, right-wing, maybe not an explicit threat to democracy, some of these other figures, but somewhat of a threat to democracy. And running against in the second round, Emmanuel Macron, who had been a minister in the former socialist government. François Fillon, who didn't make it to the second round, was the leading Republican Party, the main center-right party's candidate for president, didn't make it to the second round. So then the question was, in the second round, what would he do? Would he remain silent, as, for instance, our Republican Party did in the presidential election for the most part, people who didn't like candidate Trump? Would he endorse Le Pen because he's ideologically quite close, he's a center-right politician? Or would he cross the political aisle and support a former socialist, or a member of the socialist government? And that's what he did. He actually endorsed the socialist, and many of his voters, Fillon's voters, went to Macron. So I think, again, this is a case where you have to have the way to defeat authoritarians is the kind of politics of strange bedfellows. People who disagree on a lot, but that agree on a kind of common commitment to democratic norms, and to overlook those differences, at least in the short run.
Right, and do you think, and I'm going to read, again, I like reading this because you haven't read it, but can that happen? I want to read this, and then I want you to come back and answer, can this happen in this country around the issue that's really, I think, at the center of one of our great problems, which is polarization. Polarization can destroy democratic norms. When socioeconomic, racial, or religious differences give rise to extreme partisanship, in which societies sort themselves into political camps whose worldviews are not just different, but mutually exclusive, toleration becomes harder to sustain. Some polarization is healthy, even necessary for democracy. And indeed, the highly historical experience of democracies in Western Europe shows us what norms can be sustained, even where parties are separated by considerable ideological differences. But when societies grow so deeply divided that parties become wedded to incompatible worldviews, and especially when their members are so socially segregated that they rarely interact, stable partisan rivalries eventually give way to perceptions of mutual threat. As mutual toleration disappears, politicians grow tempted to abandon forbearance and try to win at all costs. This may encourage the rise of anti-system groups that reject democracy's rules altogether. When that happens, democracy is in trouble. And I think you could say that's happening now. So can these coalitions form? Or do you see any examples of that happening?
Yeah, depending on the day you ask me, I have different answers to that question. I mean, I wake up in the morning and watch news programs and go from one extreme to the other. Probably as many people here share that feeling. I mean, one kind of concrete example of this level of polarization. In the book, we cite this statistic. There was a study done in 1960 asking Republicans and Democrats how they would feel if their child married somebody of the other political party. And 4% and 5% of Democrats said that they would be upset if this is in 1960, if their child married somebody of the other political party. The same survey was conducted in 2015, and that number now is 50 to 60% on both sides. And so there's really a kind of deep sense of fear and loathing on both sides, I would argue. There's another Pew survey that we cite where I think it's 50% of, again, each party reports being afraid of the other party. Afraid. I mean, so this is not just disagreement. It's a kind of level of fear. So the question is, how can that be overcome? I mean, that's in effect what you're asking. And there's no quick and easy single silver bullet answer to this. I mean, one of the things that we argue that is necessary to happen is the Republican Party itself needs to be transformed. I mean, and we actually argue it needs to be refounded. I mean, easier said than done, certainly, but it needs to be refounded. And in particular, what we think is that the Republican Party is essentially a white Christian party in a very diverse society, racially, ethnically, religiously diverse society. And if you have a political party that's essentially a predominantly white Christian party in this kind of setting, it's going to be tempting to make white nationalist appeals for this party. And so in order for the party to kind of break out of this syndrome, it needs to be refounded as a much more diverse party. This is not such a radical proposal. In the 2012 autopsy of the Republican Party, they did their own study, and this is one of the things they themselves recognize, at least the authors of their own study, their own autopsy. Why did they lose the election? And one of the things they say they need to reach out to Latino voters and have a more diverse voter base. One of the striking things, though, is that this didn't happen. And you can ask, why didn't it happen? And I think part of it gets back to this issue of who is the Republican Party establishment. There really is no party to implement this agenda. So I think one of the things that needs to happen is parties need to be strengthened, and the Republican Party, and organizationally. I mean, what I mean by this is the party needs to be put in a position where it's not so completely dominated by outside moneyed interests, and that elected leaders who want to win elections and want to make these kinds of appeals actually have a chance to do it. So this is one thing. A second thing that needs to happen, though, is that Democrats, I think, need to get out of their most comfortable zones. I mean, I lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts for the last 14 years, and I don't know many Republicans, I have to say. And the few Republicans I know report to me they don't know anybody who voted for Donald Trump. So my own social circles, and I think lots of people are in this kind of situation, and that's fine. But the point is, these kind of coalitions people need to learn to speak across the party aisle.
Well, what really comes through loud and clear again in the book, not only currently but historically, is the issue of race. And the white nationalistic trend or feelings are not unique to this time period, and religion. And again, I mean, you touched on that. Can you talk a little bit more about how do you see a solution of bridging this gap on these issues, and historically, what kind of leadership did it take in countries that had these problems? Did there have to be violence first before?
Yeah, so we
break
looked
the boil.
we looked long and hard for cases of overcoming polarization, and one of the things that we've discovered is lots of cases where national catastrophe precedes overcoming polarization. And so clearly, like an example of the German experience after World War II, that's an extreme example. But even let's say Chile, after the rise of Pinochet and the breakdown of democracy, which was really driven. The U.S. played a role, but there was a kind of ripe conditions in Chile with incredible levels of polarization before 1973. At the end of the Pinochet era, Christian Democrats and socialists who had been opposed to each other throughout the time came together and started getting together on a regular basis and working together in a collaborative way, and realized how much had been lost by not cooperating. And so they got together and they kind of realized that and they set up a system of concertación where they met regularly and remained committed recommitted themselves to democratic rules. And so this became the basis for forming of the new Chilean democracy. So one of the points of our book is to try to say that, these catastrophes are the things that have often kind of spurred a kind of recommitment to overcoming polarization. Part of the point of the book is to say, well, hopefully we don't have to go through that in order to kind of reach this kind of level, overcoming polarization. A second big thing, though, kind of more concretely, that in a democracy, the best way to convince people to change is to if you lose an election. And so I think what's absolutely necessary is in order to compel the Republican Party to transform itself, it needs to suffer a series of devastating electoral losses. In the short run, that may be not sufficient. That's certainly necessary. It's not sufficient. I mean, if you imagine, and so I think November elections are absolutely critical. What may happen, of course, though, in the November elections, if Democrats retake a bunch of kind of purplish districts that are sort of, red districts they're slightly blue, you can imagine what the Republican median member of Congress is going to look like after this. They're going to be even further to the right. And so in the short run, at least, the Republican Party is going to face this kind of crisis where the party, even if it faces an electoral defeat, will be further to the right. But I think in a democracy, the only way these kind of processes of reform take place is through election laws, and so that's absolutely necessary.
So the three big themes are racial divide, religious divide, and economic inequality.
Yeah.
Really have come through in the book and how to manage that. And that's more of a statement. But one thing,
One thing I would add,
Yeah.
this is sort of somewhat of a joke, but intermarriage, that's a solution for across racial and ethnic divides. That's a solution to this problem. I mean, so the point of that, though, is that there are social transformations that are taking place that are independent of our politics. And so some of these things can, and so I think California, everywhere I travel, this is the first time I've talked about this book in California. Everywhere we go, we inevitably get a question from the audience saying, well, isn't California possibly our future, where you have, essentially a white, it's rare for a ethnic majority to lose its majority status and its dominant status. So in the United States, the idea that a white Christian majority is losing its dominant status. I mean, throughout history, this kind of creates a vulnerable situation. So, but California seems to be a model potentially for that. These kinds of things can be overcome.
have you given any talks in red states? Or been invited
So
to?
yeah, I'm going to Kentucky in a couple of weeks to speak with the League of Women Voters. So. Which is a nonpartisan organization. I went to Central Pennsylvania, which is kind of red territory. But we wrote this book really actually with kind of a couple of different audiences in mind. But one is exactly the point you made. Republicans who we thought could step up and protect our democracy as well. See, we think that's critical. And it's been reviewed in some conservative publications, and some of the reviews say, well, this is a great book when dealing with countries outside of the U.S., but as soon as they get to the U.S., it all goes wrong. And so what that suggests to me is that this is part of the polarization that we face. We're the same guys who wrote the first half and the second half, and
Right.
so that's just how it goes.
So, again, historically, you look, and this is a question I'm interested in personally as a journalist, but you talk about the rise of Hitler in the 20th century, other totalitarians, Pinochet, others you've mentioned. None of them really happened in the age of the internet or technology. So the role of media, and I differentiate between media and journalism, what role does it play, and how crucial is it to either helping the authoritarian or stopping him or her?
Yeah, well, if you look back over the past year, which of our social and political institutions have performed well? Some have performed better than others. For instance, our Congress has not performed very well. One institution that has performed very well is the media and journalism in particular. I think a lot of people could say the media did not do so great during the campaign. But since the election, I think the media has, there's been real attention and incredible work being done, exposing and trying to, hold our elected leaders accountable and exposing all sorts of wrongdoing. And so I think this is absolutely critical. And that's one thing that gives me a lot of hope, actually, is because, in a lot of other countries, this has not been the case. And so in general, I think our media have done a good job. We were talking back, well, you said, you distinguish between media and journalism, which maybe I'd like to hear what you mean by that. But I think in general, the media and journalists have done quite a good job.
Well, I think media is a lot of it's entertainment and business models like Fox and MSNBC, which are based on total political point of view, and people like Sean Hannity or Rush Limbaugh, they're media.
Right.
They're not journalists, and you could argue purely propagandists, or clearly with a point of view. So I think that's really confusing. And I think another big issue, obviously, is the audience reflects the polarization in terms of where they get their information. And when the president calls journalists the enemy, the media the enemy of the people, I mean, he's setting up a dynamic or fake news where media journalism are blended, and depending on your political point of view, it's part of this whole toxic brew of polarization. I don't know historically how that plays out.
Well, one thing that's clear is that, there's actually lots of good social scientific evidence now on this. People are beginning to work on this. So what is the effect of echo chambers on people? Does this contribute to polarization? And so only hearing news that you agree with. And so people in experimental settings social scientists will pay people to only listen to media they agree with, and see where, and ask them a series of questions before and then ask them a series of questions later. And it's clear that this has some kind of polarizing effect, both on left and right, that when you only hear media that you agree with, it pushes you further to the extremes. That said, the findings tend to be, they're in experimental kind of artificial settings. They're, small percentage shifts. And I think in many ways, you'd asked about the role of social media. I mean, new forms of media, people have argued to contribute to polarization. Looking at only on your Twitter feed or Facebook account where you only look at things that you unfriend people you disagree with. This probably contributes. But I really do have the feeling that these at the margins have an impact, but underlying this are these deeper demographic trends. I mean, so in the book we argue since beginning in the 60s with the passage of the Voting Rights and the Civil Rights Act and major immigration reform, you had a transformation in the American electorate. And in the 1960s, you had essentially two political parties, Democrats and Republicans, that were a mixed bag of conservatives and liberals. And they were predominantly white parties. With the passage of the Voting Rights and the Civil Rights Act, Southern blacks went to the Democratic Party, Southern whites went to the Republican Party, immigrants and their children started supporting the Democratic Party, and evangelical Christians who tended to be split between both parties, by the 1980s were voting for the Republican Party. So by the time you got to the era of Newt Gingrich, you had two very different political parties. One, there was a kind of the Democratic Party, party of urban educated whites, and mixed demographic ethnic minorities. The Republican Party, predominantly a white Christian party. So with these kinds of underlying demographic patterns, this is what I think is really driving polarization. And media and these other factors certainly are contributing to it and exacerbating it. But I don't think we can blame media.
Is the support of, and this was an audience question as well, of the evangelicals for Trump based on race?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. That's an audience question? Yeah. This would be something that would be very easy to answer, kind of I mean, I think one could try to disentangle this. I think there's certain key issues that President Trump has remained committed to. I mean, with the court, and sort of handed things over in terms of picking justices, and been very much a mainstream Republican, and sort of abdicating in some sense to what the Republican Party wants. And I think, with the idea that courts are, the fights over abortion rights, for instance, this is something that's really important. The court, as long as, he delivers on that, then this is like the only thing that really matters. So, I mean, I'm not sure if it's all just about race. I haven't seen any evidence.
And there's a lot of distraction, obviously, at the top, and as you studied authoritarians, but underlying all the distraction from the White House, a lot of things are happening that are sort of undermining the norms. I mean, are there things we should be watching, or the things that you're tracking related to the norms? We've mentioned the courts, other things, because all the noise at the top.
Yeah, I think the attacks on the media, but that's gotten a lot of attention. I mean, one kind of thing where when people say it's just all talk, the kind of verbal attacks on media and on court and so on. I mean, one striking figure I've seen is that over a majority of Republicans think the media are the enemy of the people, and that media restrictions should be imposed. Kind of another major area is the constant attacks on the legitimacy of our elections and the baseless accusations that are made that our elections are rigged and that there's lots of voter ID fraud, for which there's absolutely no evidence. But the frequent repeating of that, again, people may say, well, this is just words, but actually a majority of Republicans now say that election voter ID fraud is rampant. And so these are ways in which the attacks on our norms actually weaken our institutions. Because if you think, is it possible really to have a viable democracy where a majority of one party think the media are totally corrupt and think our elections are rigged? These are two pillars of any democracy. And if voters don't have trust in those institutions, then that's certainly very worrying. So this is where words do matter.
That's scary. What is there, I mean, following that up, is there, if we're watching, are there signals or bells or things we should be, even that frighten you in terms of the norms that you're watching? Yeah,
well, what I just said to you is one thing, but I think another thing that what area where I've become more pessimistic? I mean, some areas I've been more optimistic, some areas where I've become more pessimistic.
Let's start with pessimism and then go to optimism.
Okay, good. That's good. It's a sunny day after.
But after pessimism, I'd have to say something. Go ahead.
Okay. So, the unwillingness of the Republican Party to stand up for to obvious violations of things that you see these guys being interviewed and, what do you think of this? And they're obviously uncomfortable, don't like the kind of attacks and rhetoric that are taking place by the president, and yet they're unwilling to directly criticize him. And so this complete unwilling, and one of the key lessons, I mean, this is about political courage in large part. I mean, one of the key lessons of the history of democracy. And Juan Linz, this great political scientist who lived through Weimar Germany and the Spanish Civil War, said, to save a democracy, people, even when you agree with somebody ideologically, when they're violating democratic rules, you need to step up and criticize this.
Okay, now I have to say something, then we'll go to optimism and a solution, hopefully. But it's time. It's time. We have one last question in the program that flew by. But I want to offer our thanks to Dr. Daniel Ziblatt, Professor of Government at Harvard University and co-author of the new book, How Democracies Die. We also thank our audiences here and on radio, television, and the internet. I want to remind everyone here that Dr. Ziblatt's book is for sale and he'll sign outside the room immediately following the program. And last question.
Yeah, on optimism.
Yeah.
Well, one, I'm not sure if this is the silver bullet. I mean, part of the story is that there's lots of people need to do lots of things to restore our democracy. But one thing that we don't write about in the book, but that I've experienced since talking to people, are the role of professions and professional ethics. And so whether lawyers, journalists, teachers, people who abide by a set of professional codes which inoculate them from authoritarian appeals. And I think it's absolutely critical that journalists continue to abide by their professional ethics, and that lawyers and judges do as well as academics and social scientists and scientists. And that, that I hadn't fully appreciated to what degree that actually helps protect our democracy.
Okay, well, thank you. Again, thank you, Dr. Ziblatt.
Thank you. Thanks.
And I'm Robert Rosenthal of the Center for Investigative Reporting. And now this meeting of the Commonwealth Club, the place where you're in the know, is adjourned.